Hey, what's going on everyone? My name is Hunter and welcome to a brand new SvelteKit video. In today's video, we're going to be learning about form actions in SvelteKit. And to do so, we'll be putting the pieces together for this contact manager application that I've went ahead and done the initial style and structure for already, as that's not the main focus of the video. But essentially our goal is going to be able to add and delete contacts. And we'll be starting out with some regular form actions. And then towards the end of the video, we'll implement progressive enhancement, which will allow us to, take advantage of JavaScript to improve the user experience if JavaScript is available. However, our forms will still be functional even if JavaScript is not available. So let's take a look at what we have so far as code. Inside of our contacts folder, we have a page.server.js, which just has a default contact here that we are setting up, Saul Goodman. And you could think of this contacts as your database, right? In most cases, if you want to render out data in a table like this one, you have a load function which fetches data from your database and then passes it to the page.svelte. And if you're not familiar with how load functions work, I'd highly suggest that you take a look at my loading data in SvelteKit video, which I will have a card for in the top right, as well as a link to in the video description. So this array of contacts gets passed into our page.svelte through this load function. And then we accept those contacts in the form of a data prop here. And as you can see inside of our page.svelte, we also have our form that's being rendered on the page right now. You can see that we have the name, email, company, and job. And then at the bottom, we have the contacts table, which we are passing data.contacts, which is that data prop with the contacts into. And if we take a look at this contacts table, it's a literal copy and paste of Daisy UI's one of their tables. I just replaced some of the blanks with the contact information. So you can see here that it's accepting the prop contacts, and then we're actually running in each block for each contact and then rendering out one of these rows for each contact, right? So it's very simple. If you take a look at the code, I'll have the source code in the description. It's very simple, nothing overly complex here. I'm also generating a random avatar with this Pravatar link here as well, as you can see. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get into implementing some form actions. So we define our form actions inside of the page.server.js of whatever page we want to add these actions to. And we're going to start out with the default action, right? So what we're going to say is we're going to say export const actions. It's an object. And then we're going to say default as one of the properties. And it's going to be an async function. And then what we're going to take out of this is going to be the request. And let me show you really quick where I'm getting this from. So if we look at the SvelteKit documentation, I think it's very important that you understand how to find the information you're looking for and how to experiment and kind of figure out, even though the documentation isn't super straightforward, you can still kind of figure out what you're looking for by digging a little bit deeper. So if we look at the anatomy of an action here, we can see that each action receives a request event object, which is what would be inside of these parentheses here. And then we're taking out the request from that object, right? We're destructuring the request out of that object. So if we click on this request event here, we can see what this looks like. We can see the interface for it. We can see that it has, cookies, it has locals, params, requests. Really, I think the ones you're going to really care the most about are going to be the locals, params, requests, and cookies. Especially if you're doing any type of authentication system, you want to definitely have access to those cookies there. But for now, we're just going to worry about the request, which contains the form data. So let me just show you really quick. So we can actually take form data out of the request. Const form data equals await request.form data. And now it's just console log form data. And I'm going to be doing quite a lot of console logs during this video. I think it's very helpful with visualizing how data is being passed around, what you're receiving where. I think it really helps kind of put the pieces together and make sense of what you're actually doing versus just typing in a bunch of lines of code that work, but you don't really know why or how they work. So let's go back to our contacts here. And we can see we need to submit this form. And the default action, we actually don't have to specify anything except for a method on our form. So if we go to our form here and we type method equals post, by default, if there's no action specified and there's a default action defined inside of the page.server file, it's going to hit this action here. So we can save. And now what we can do is we can just type some data in and we can watch the console on our server side. So I'll just say Walt. When I hit enter, you can see that we get a form data object back inside of our console. That's where console logging here. And you can see that it has a few different name properties. It's a bunch of different objects, each with their own name property and their own value property. And you may be asking yourself, okay, where's it getting these names from? Well, if we look inside of our form, we can see that each input has a name property. And if you notice, this matches up perfectly with what is returned inside of form data. Now, there's a few different ways we can extract this data. I would probably recommend looking up, a helper function and defining a helper function somewhere in your utilities to where you can easily just pass the entire form data object to it, and then it'll just return a nice, beautiful object full of your values. But for purposes of this video, we're just going to keep it simple here. We'll just say const name equals form data.get And then we're going to pass in the name value, right? So the value of this name tag here. So that's going to be our name that we passed in. And then we'll say email, formData.get email. And I'll just copy this a few more times here. We'll say company, and then we'll say job. And then just to show you that we are in fact getting that name back, for example, let's just run another one. You can see that we do in fact get Walt back here. Another thing that we're going to need is an ID. And we can pretty easily by saying const ID equals crypto. This is a built-in library dot random UUID. And that's going to be useful later when we go to actually delete an item. And you'll see that will come up here in a few minutes. So now that we have all this data, this is where you can do a few different things. You can start to, construct a database object and then save it to your database. You can do some validation, which we're going to touch on here shortly. So in this step, we're going to build a contact out of this data here, and then we're going to push it to this array, and then it's going to display on our page. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can just define const contact, and we'll say ID, name, email, company, and job. And then we can say contacts.push contact. So we're basically adding this contact to this array. We can save. Now let's go ahead and test this out by creating a new contact. And you can see that we do in fact get this added here, right? So you can see that the data is now being pushed to the contacts. However, right now our application has no idea if that was successful or if it was a failure or if we need to do anything else. So let's return something here. Let's return success is true. And just so you're aware, whenever we're using this page.server here and we actually save this file and it reloads the server, it's going to delete the context that we added, after the fact. And it's just going to keep this default contact here. Okay. So that's why you'll see this delete. But if you're using an actual database, which you probably should be, that obviously won't happen to you. So what are we returning here? And you may be asking yourself, okay, where does this go? Where is this return value being passed to? We're obviously returning it somewhere, right? Well, let's go into our page.svelte and let's export let form. And let's console log form. Now let's rerun this. And we can see that in our console, we get success is true. Additionally, inside of our client side console, we get success is true, which is pretty interesting, right? That means that we can, pass some information about our form back to our client side, which could be useful for things like validation and being able to return data back to the form itself. So let's go ahead and set up some very, very basic validation. I do plan on doing a full video on validation with SvelteKit, but this video, it would just be too long if I went into it. So we'll just go into, surface level so you can get an idea. And I think, once you see how this works, you'll be able to kind of brainstorm and take those ideas and run with them and build up your own, nice looking UI with great validation. So let's just say that we want to make sure that the name is at least 2 characters, right? So let's say if name.length is less than 2, we're going to return invalid with a 400, and then we're going to pass an object. And you can see here that invalid comes from SvelteJS/kit, and you'll see what this is going to look like here shortly. So we'll say error is true, and message is name must be at least 2 characters. Okay, cool. So now let's go ahead and trigger this, right? Let's go ahead and trigger this by passing in a name that is not at least 2 characters. And we'll go into we'll pop up in our console over here, and we'll just say W. And I'm just going to kind of keep these quick requests here short so we're not wasting too much time. And we're not seeing anything on our console. Let's make sure, we're not console logging the form anymore. So my bad. Let's console log that. Okay, so now you can see the message that came through. It says error is true, message, name must be at least 2 characters. Okay, well that's cool, but our entire form is reset. So I don't know if you think that's annoying, but I think it's really annoying if I go and fill out an entire form and I didn't pass validation on one field, so it resets the whole form and I have to start from scratch. We definitely don't want that. So how can we prevent that from happening? Well, instead of just returning an error in a message, we can also return the actual form data values here. So we can just say name, email, company, job. And we'll omit ID for the time being because the ID really shouldn't get generated until it passes validation. Because that would be, as it hits your database, for example, once it passed the validation, then it would get its ID. So we'll move that down here. So now let's try it out. So let's go and create another one. So add. Okay, so you can see here that we are getting these values, and let me actually just submit something that isn't just a W. So we'll say, just so you can better see what we're working with here. So we now have my job is job. We have the company is my company, and we have an email here. So we have access to this information now in the front end, in the client, as well as in our page.svelte. So how do we go about getting that information back into our form? Well, it's pretty simple. So remember, we have access to this form, right? And this form is this object here, which has a company property, an email property, a job property, and a name property. So let's go ahead and wire this up. What we can do is inside of our inputs, we can say value equals form question mark dot name for this one. And then we'll run double question marks here and an empty string. So we're doing optional chaining here, which essentially is just like using the dot. So it's the same thing as using form.name, except if this doesn't exist, it won't give us an error. It'll just be undefined, which is a falsy value. So that means this would be false, right? This evaluation, this expression would be false, which means it would result in an empty string. So basically, to simplify this, if this exists, put this as the value. If it doesn't, put an empty string. So we'll copy this and we'll use the same thing on all the inputs. So we'll go to this next input here. We'll change this to form.email. We'll go to the company one, the same thing. And then we'll go into the job. Now when I hit save, you'll see that this data was already populated. So we can just kind of reset this all together and just test it out again. So let's just say mike@example.com, Mike co-CEO. Okay. So all the data was passed back, and you can see that the form retained its information, right? It just received a message saying that name must be at least 2 characters. And then if we pass 2 characters in, the form resets because we get a success is true. And this data was not returned. Form.email, form.name evaluated to false because it doesn't exist. So it put an empty string there, right? And let's just say, for example, that you didn't want to return all the fields. So I'm sure that all of you are familiar. If you go to register for a site, you put in your password, you confirm your password, and then you have a validation issue. When it comes back, it's going to clear your password out, so you have to type it in again. So to do something like that, all we have to do is just omit that value, whatever we don't want to return here. So let's just say we didn't want to return the company. Type in our name. Now our company is not populated here, right? We didn't return it. So great. All of this seems to be working as expected. And we can just run one more test run here. So we can just say Jesse. We have Jesse, and now we want to actually delete items, right? This is where we run into the problem with using a default action. Since both of these forms or both of these actions essentially are being conducted on the same page, we actually can't use default. We need to use named actions. And if we look here at the SvelteKit documentation, we can see that instead of one default action, a page can have as many named actions as it needs. You can see that we drop the default and we replace it with a name. And then to invoke that named action, we need to add a query parameter with a name prefixed by a / character to our form. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll go into our page.server first, and we'll change this action to create, because this is going to be creating a contact, right? And you'll see if we try to click anything, we're going to get an error because it says no action with name default found. So inside that form, we need to actually specify the action. We'll say action equals, so we're going to do a query parameter, so question mark, and then / the name of the action, right? You can see here that now, if we try to run the same thing, it's working again. So now let's go ahead and implement our delete, right? We're going to click on this button and have it delete these contacts. So let's first look at what this delete button looks like. So if we go into our contacts table, we'll see that currently we just have a button here, right? So how are we supposed to make this button trigger an action within our page.server.js? Well, it's simple. We're going to turn it into a form. So we'll create a form tag here. And then inside of the form, we're also going to put an input. It's going to be a type hidden. We're also going to say hidden here. And then we're going to say value is going to be contact.id. Because remember, we have access to this contact here, and we need some way to identify which contact we're trying to delete. So each one of these buttons is going to then, hit our delete action once we create it. And it's going to have form data or it's going to have the ID as a part of form data. So we can set the name is equal to ID. And then the action is going to be question mark /delete. We'll create that in just a second. We'll say method post. And then we can come into our page.server.js and we can define that next action. So after we get, after create, we can put a comma because this is an object, remember, and we can say delete. And this is going to be asynchronous as well. We're going to take in the request again because we're getting that form data, right? And we're going to say const form data equals await request.form data. And then we'll say const ID equals form data.get ID. And let's just make sure that we're getting this when we click delete, right? So I just saved, and we can see that if we click delete here, let's check our console. If we click delete, we're now going to have the ID, which if you notice, this matches 981 matches Saul Goodman's UUID. So now we have access to that. And, if you're obviously working with a database, for example, this is where you'd make that call to go and delete this ID. Now, something to keep in mind though, is that although we hid that input, it's not invisible to the user. So I can just use this here and go to the delete button, and let's see here. here. Right above it, I can see there's an input here with a type of hidden, and I can also see the value. So again, this shouldn't be any type of secret value. It could also be edited by the user before submitting the form. So you obviously want to make sure that you're checking for proper authentication, authorization, things of that nature. But that's how we're passing that ID over to our action, right? So now how do we actually remove this? We're just going to filter the array. Again, like I said, obviously if you're running a database, you would want to go and delete that item, but let's just filter our array. So we'll say contacts equals contacts.filter, contact ID is not equal to ID. So basically what this filter does, if you're unfamiliar, is we're saying go through that array, and then if each item in the array is represented as contact, so for example, this is the first one, if that ID, if this evaluates to true, we're going to keep it. If it's false, we're going to filter it out. We're going to remove it, right? So every contact except for the one with the ID that matches will be retained inside of that contacts array, and the one that matches will be taken out. So we can actually save this here and test it out. So if we hit delete, you can now see that Saul Goodman is gone. And we're also console logging form still, so I'm just going to remove that for the time being. And we can add another one here. And you can see that we can delete Walt too. So that's really as simple as it is to delete. We can also make sure we return something here. So return success is true, because then it would allow us to display some type of like toast or something. We could track that inside of page.svelte the same way that we track anything else, right? We could track it and then show a toast saying that your contact was successfully deleted, okay? So now it's time to talk a little bit about progressive enhancement, what that is, what we're doing currently versus what we're going to be doing here in a few minutes. So if we check our format again here, we can see that the page is reloading on every single form submission, right? Same thing for deleting. If we delete, you can see that the whole page reloaded. And if you're coming from something like React, for example, you know that, typically you're not actually reloading the whole page. It's just a single page application. And that's generally a better user experience. It seems almost like the thing was just ripped out of their website. They didn't actually have to reload the page. They can just delete the item and it goes away without any type of reloading. Even though it's quick, we still want to improve that user experience. So if we read SvelteKit's documentation here, and we scroll down to progressive enhancement, you can see that they mentioned that in the tutorial, they built an action that works without JavaScript. That's great, but when JavaScript is available, we can progressively enhance our form interactions to provide a user experience just as we had just discussed. And it says the easiest way to use or to progressively enhance a form is to add the use enhance action. You can see that we import this and then we just simply add it to our form. And then it says without an argument, use enhance will emulate the browser native behavior just without the full page reloads. It's going to update the form property, page.form and page.status on a successful or invalid response, but only if the action is on the same page you're submitting from. So actions can be submitted to any other pages. So basically we could put a form on /users, for example, and then hit our contacts action by using action to be /contacts !/create. We can create a new contact like that, right? But if we're doing that, we're not going to get these same enhancements that we would get if we're doing it on the same page. It's also going to invalidate all data. Invalidate all, for reference, just makes the load function rerun, essentially. So you're going to get that refresh data back. And then it also will render the nearest error boundary if an error occurs. So we can customize the behavior by providing a function that runs before the form is submitted and returns a callback with the action result. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at next, is actually enhancing our form to use JavaScript when it's available. And so let's go ahead and do that. And you'll see why I actually made this the way that I did with the form and the table on the same page, because it is different. It requires less work if you have the form on a separate page than the actual table or the data that you're trying to display, for example. So let's take a look at this. And we'll start by just adding that default use enhance just to kind of see what's going to happen when we add that, right? So inside of our page.svelte, we're going to import the enhance from app/forms. And then inside of our form here, we're going to say use enhance. And then also inside of our contacts table, we need to go to that button, the form here, and do the same thing. Make sure we import that up top. Great. So let's just see what happens now. So let's refresh. Let's save our page.server so we can get a value back. So now when we delete something, it works just as expected. You can see that there's no loading of the page. So when we click delete, watch, browser doesn't reload, but the item is deleted, right? And again, I'm bringing the item back by just hitting save on this page over here. So it reloads that data. Well, let's just say we want to create a new contact. Let's just say we want to create Hunter. Hit add. Okay, it works, but the form is still populated with data, and I can just spam enter and it will just create a ton of me's, right? That actually looks pretty close to what I look like in real life, so that's pretty accurate. So basically what we want to do is we actually want to clear this form out unless the data is invalid. And by using the default use enhance, we can't do that. So we're going to have to make some adjustments. So inside of our page.svelte, we actually need to extend this use enhance function. I'm going to move this to the end of this tag here so that it's a little bit cleaner. And we're going to pass this a function that we're going to define inside of the use enhance. So we're going to take in some parameters and we're going to take in form. And then we're going to return async with destructure results, results and update. So this is how it looks. And let's just save it so it formats it, makes it look nicer. So if we look back at the documentation here, we can see that use enhance can take in form, data, action, and cancel. We see that form is the form element. Data is its form data object. And then action is the URL to which the form is posted. Cancel will prevent the submission. And then inside of the return, the callback, we can get result, which is an action result object. We'll take a look at that in a second. And then update is a function which triggers the logic that will be triggered if this callback wasn't set. So all that default logic up here we were talking about where it says without an argument, it will emulate the browser native behavior. So we need to take care of that. So let's just take a look at some of these things that are being passed into use enhance. So let's look at form, let's look at data, and let's look at action. We're not going to look at cancel because again, that's just going to cancel the submission. And a good way to think about this is this runs before form submission to server, and this runs after form submission to server. Okay. So let's just console log some of these. So we're going to console log form is going to be form. We'll say this is going to be data. And then this will be action, right? Action, yep. And then we can also console log the result. We're not going to console log the update because that's a function and we don't want to call that. So we'll say results. And let's just see what happens. So let's open up our console on our browser. Okay, and you can already see that we have some data here. Let's just clear that out. And let us just submit something in this form. So let's submit. So let's hit add. We can see here we get a bunch of data. We get the form, which is literally this form object here. I mean, you can even see when I'm hovering over it, it's selecting the items inside of that form. So we can see our form object here we have access to. We also have access to the form data. And we also have access to the action, which is basically what we're trying to hit. And you can see that we are looking for create. You can get a bunch of information regarding the destination. So you could do things like if it's heading for this destination, do this. If it's destined for this location, do that. So there's a lot of different things you can do here. It's really flexible and they give you a lot of information that you can use. So inside the result, we can see that, remember, this is after the form submits to the server. You can see that we get a type of success. We also get a data where it says success is true. Now, the type of success should not be confused with success is true. This is our own return statement here. This is coming from the form. So if the form successfully submits, it will return success. If not, it will return invalid or an error. Right? So let's just see what we can do with this information that we have, these different inputs we can take in, right? So the first thing that we want to do is we want to reset the form once it comes back on the callback, right? So once it gets submitted to the server and it's successful, we want it to reset the form. So how do we do that? Well, if we look at the form.reset, and it's going to search Bing because I'm on my guest, but we can see here that form.reset is actually a HTML DOM API, and we can reset the form to all of its default values, right? So the default values for our form are defined inside of page.svelte. If we look here, this is the default value. And since we're not going to be returning this information on a successful response, it will result in this. So we can do that inside of our callback by simply running form.reset right here. Instead of this console log, we'll just run form.reset. And again, we have access to that form because we received it here. We're actually not going to use data or action. So we'll just take those out. So we're going to say form.reset, but we only want it to reset if it was successful. So we can say if result.type equals success, then we want to do a form reset, right? So if you recall, the result.type again is not to be confused with the success true, right? The result.type comes from the form. So if we return here, for example, an invalid, it's going to be invalid. If we returned an error here, it would be an error. If we don't return anything, if we just return, it's going to be successful. So what we want to do really quick is actually set up a way to kind of display the alerts. I know we're kind of bouncing away from what we were just doing, but I think this is important to get to the next step so we can see some of the differences here and why we have to do certain things the way we have to do them. So let's go ahead and set up our alert component. Again, this is just copied from Daisy UI. It just takes in a message and just displays a little red alert. So what we want to do is when we have an error, like for example, this one, we want to actually show that error message and that alert while the error exists. So if we go into page.svelte and we go to the bottom here, the bottom of our form, we're going to just import the alert component. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say if form dot, I think we named it message, right? Message or form.error. Let's do if form.error first. If there's an error, then we're going to pass message equals form.message. So now let's go ahead and create an error on our form. You can see that it's not updating because we are using this enhancements, right? So if we disable JavaScript right now, so let's go into our Chrome tools here and let's just disable Now when we click add, we're going to see that, right? So we should be seeing that message regardless. So right now we just have our page or our use enhance set up for success, right? We're not doing anything with the invalids. So we want this to show up even when we have JavaScript enabled. Let's go ahead and get that working. So what we're going to do is we're going to clear this query from the URL, and we're going to say if result.type equals invalid, we're going to run await apply action, which is imported from app/forms, and we're going to pass in the result. So let's save this really quick. Let's see if this works. So if we say H, now we can see that we get that error message here, right? Even with JavaScript enabled. However, our form, when we submit it still, so if I say Hunter, we can see that we did add it, right? The form cleared, the form reset as expected. But when we refreshed it for 1, this didn't go away. And for 2, we have to refresh the page in order to actually see this populate here. So let's take a look at how we can do that. If we look at the form actions documentation, we can see that we have an update, which is a function that triggers the logic that will be triggered if this callback wasn't set. So, which is all of this logic here, where it invalidates all data. That's the big piece that we're looking for here, is it invalidates all data, which makes that load function run again. Because right now, the load function is only running one time. It's not running whenever we submit this form, and we want that to happen. So to do so, we can just simply say update. Now we add somebody, let's just add Paul. Now you can see that it does in fact populate, right? And if we just, again, cause an error of some sort, you can see that the name must be at least 2 characters. Okay, let's just make it Pablo, add. The error message goes away, and we're now getting this here. And our delete buttons still work as expected, right? Using that use enhance defaults, which is fine because we're not doing anything super crazy with that. We're just deleting it. Want to disappear. So that is how we can use form actions with and without JavaScript. And I can show you really quick if I just disable JavaScript again, just to show you that all of this functionality still works with JavaScript disabled. So let's delete this contact. Let's add a new one. Okay, that works just as expected, right? Let's cause an error here. Oh, we got an error. Name, error goes away. So again, this is without JavaScript whatsoever. So the reason that we have to do this use enhance is because we are not being redirected. For example, we want the data to dynamically update on the page that the form is being submitted on, right? So, in most applications, or in a lot that I've seen recently, you have a form on a separate page, and maybe once you, for example, add a new contact, it will immediately take you to the contacts page, right? So after you added that contact, you want to go to that contacts page, so you can start adding some more details about it. That's actually handled through a redirect. So instead of just returning success as true here, we could simply throw a redirect, which comes from SvelteKit. We can just say 303 and we'll just say / right? We want to redirect to the home page after we submit. So in your example, or in our example here, let's just say our contact list was on another page. We had a modal, or we had a page that took us to add the contact, and we had a contact on a separate page. We want to redirect to the contact list after we submitted this form, if it was successful, of course, right? So in that case, we would just set this here. So now when I submit that form, all of this logic still took place. It just took me to the homepage instead. And then when I go back to contacts, you can see that now I have myself that I just created here on the contacts page. So I think it's going to cover what I wanted to cover with form actions. If you guys have any questions or you would like me to make anything more specific, I am planning on doing a validation video, which gives us a much better way to validate than just using a bunch of if statements here. But other than that, if you guys have any questions or you'd like to see anything specific related to form actions, please let me know. I greatly appreciate all the support that I've been getting lately. I think we've gained, 200 subscribers in the past few weeks, which is incredible. So I really thank you guys a lot for your support. As always, if you guys have Discord, I do have a Discord server that's currently growing, currently under construction. Feel free to hop in there and drop me a note, leave me a message. We're trying to build a little community in there of people that are actively looking to develop on SvelteKit. So that'll about do it. As always, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.